So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Welcome to our weekly marriage hour here on Trending. Joining me in just a little bit will be our matchmaker, Cristina Pineda from Matchmakers in the City, talking about everything fair and love, war. We'll be talking about relationships and marriages and how our upbringing and generational sin can actually make that a little difficult, but you can take back your dating game and your love life to truly be happy as our Lord has called us to. He's called us to communion with others. And so what better way than to address some of those hiccups along the way that can sometimes stymie that dating and romance process, but not for much longer, because that's why we discuss marriage here on Trending. I've thrown up a questionnaire on my Instagram story asking, what would you like to hear discussed during today's marriage hour? Some of the topics that we'll be discussing later on have to do with choices you make with regard to fertility and how other people may respond and feel judged because of a choice maybe you chose to make in line with the Catholic Church. Also, how do you spice up your relationship and get a little more romance? Now, I'm not sure if the person asking this was talking about romance in general, because romance doesn't always include sex, or if they're talking about getting jiggy in the bedroom. So we'll go ahead and come back on that topic a little later to increase romance in your life from multiple perspectives. So coming up, another topic that I have been wanting to discuss, one that many married parents find themselves facing, has to do with, can children in a demanding career be complementary or even possible? Now, many people find themselves in situations where they are forced to work more than they want or at all, given the current cost of living and the demands of family life. Now, when we talk about whether or not, as parents, having children in a demanding career are possible, sometimes the problem is that we don't first think about the child. In many studies, they show that who suffers most from the conflict with regard to work and the upbringing of children? Well, it's actually the children themselves, which should point ultimately to the antidote. Now, if we were to look at this from a Catholic perspective, what's the responsibility of married couples? Well, they're called to the procreation and education of children. So that should give us a hint as to the priority of what the church emphasizes with regard to having children. But we can also talk about this from the perspective of child development and what a kid actually needs. So to unpack and complement both the church's teaching and psychology, I'm looking at a piece from Betty Bouzian. She's a French psychologist and psychoanalyst who says a lot having to do with children and their upbringing and what they need. Now, if we look at what's going on in the culture, there is a symptom right now of children who feel sick. Maybe it's coming out and their tummy hurts. They don't really feel like going to school. They're feeling somewhat depressed. It's actually a feeling of abandonment that many children experience. This can be played out in eating disorders. I have a dear friend who works as a nutritionist, and she was talking about how when she coaches many children, for example, the children can often end up having food-related issues because it's their coping mechanism. And so they start to turn to overeating or indulging in foods that they shouldn't indulge in because they're feeling a little abandoned and sick, and they're trying to feel a little better, and sometimes food just helps that. And so the problem isn't actually their diet. The problem is whether or not the parent is present in the home. In addition, kids are showing a lot of symptoms of lost confidence in adults. We've talked about it often here on Trending, how there's this sense of lost affirmation that we are seeing multiple generations now who have been unaffirmed. And this comes back to parenting. In fact, if we look, though, at child psychological development, babies, and all the way up to 3-year-olds, so essentially infants through toddlers, cannot understand the absence of a parent because, in part, they can't understand time. It's not until after the age of 3 that they begin to grasp concepts of time. Children above this age, however, even when they struggle with a separation from a parent, can be taught coping mechanisms to help them understand or feel close to the parent still. One, for example, is to tell the child, imagine your dad or mom's face in your mind. Notice how you can imagine them? Well, they're imagining you too. And this gives some affirmation to the child when that separation ensues. Now, one of the things that psychologist and psychoanalyst Eddie Buzian ends up saying is that a child is essentially not a grown-up and shouldn't be forced to be, quote, reasonable about a parent's absence. So often parents feel frustrated and pulled, and so they try to over-explain their absence to kids. This ultimately leaves them more confused and even anxious. So what's the answer? Sometimes parents try to avoid the problem with gifts and keeping a very, very busy after-school activity schedule. And part of it is because they have a difficult time giving up a career they love and giving up even a contribution they can make in a way different from raising their children. And so what do kids ultimately need? Well, this psychoanalyst and psychologist emphasizes that really up until through the age of those toddler years, a child needs at least one parent present for that baby and toddler. Now, this is really important because what we see the child learns are things such as security, self-confidence. This is only accomplished with the two things, the presence of the parent and time given. It's not easy, as we discuss often here on the show, in the culture we live in, to give up our time, to sacrifice our time for something we sometimes think is less valuable or makes us less valuable. Many parents feel this tug and pull, and so that question comes back up, are children in a demanding career possible? Well, psychoanalyst Eddie Buzian ends up commenting that essentially parents have to be willing to give something up. This is a sacrifice that perhaps leads you to work in a more intensive career later on as the children have gotten older. But the bottom line is that what she emphasizes are those first number of years with the children, especially through age 3 in particular. And we could talk more about child psychology and development as the years go on, but that presence for a child who cannot grasp, as I mentioned, absence or time up until that age, it points back to what the church teaches, that parents have a priority, the procreation and education of children. This is what Catholic marriage centers around. So it doesn't just mean, hey, here we are, we're going to co-create with God and bringing new life into the world. It also means that there are responsibilities in terms of their education, their formation. Now, it's interesting because if you actually look at some of the studies of young children, children learn basic ideas, for example, such as unconditional love from a parent and trust. In fact, in those first 3 months of development, an infant needs a need to be met 1,000 times, 1,000 times quickly, promptly by a parent in order for them to learn that someone will take care of them. That's just a little baby needing to learn this affirmation. Imagine what happens when a child doesn't learn that. When a person, even an adult, we're going to talk about this later, when an adult then in a marriage years later does not feel affirmed or complimented by their spouse. These key developmental elements and milestones in a child's life are so important. And I think that this is what we have to refocus when we ask questions such as, can I have a demanding career and have a kid? There has to be a child-first approach, and we have to acknowledge the needs of child development. Those two go hand in hand. And certain children have more needs than others. I've seen admirable parents who have had to make sacrifices based on the needs of a child who has taken longer to bond with other kids, who perhaps struggle with some sort of educational or mental delay in their growth and maturity. These are things that ultimately come back to the parents and the married couple. And I turn yet again with great joy and peace and solace to what the church says. The parents are the primary educators of their children, and married persons are called to the procreation education of their kids. These aren't hard, sterile words. They're words to inspire, direct, and guide us in making that sacrificial offering for those we are called to bring into the world. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Joining me is Cristina Pineda, matchmaker from Matchmakers in the City, matchmaking royals, celebrities, and as I say, us normal folk, Catholics as well. Cristina, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Timmerie. Great to be back.
Well, you have been quite busy these last few months, and I know that you were wanting to discuss today generational sin and dating and how it even impacts marriages. Now, I thought it was interesting because you had been inspired by some of the topics I had mentioned last week having to do with these shocking votes that were casted in the recent election, such as Washington State voting for comprehensive sex education for minors that is overly sexualizing, or Oregon decriminalizing hard drugs like methamphetamines and cocaine, or even Las Vegas voting for the first time toward same-sex marriage. It brings up a lot of questions about the family and how we got here, and I imagine you see this come up often, not just in a voting atmosphere, but how this plays out with your bachelors and bachelorettes.
That's so true. And at Matchmakers in the City, we see the how these attitudes impact people's dating lives, and in that microcosm of the dating world. And what I have been date coaching a lot of men and women about recently, especially, has been looking at their pasts and examining their pasts, their family and heritage, so that we can help to break the cycle of dysfunction that they have found themselves in. And a lot of these people who I'm coaching, their parents grew up in the 70s during the sexual revolution, and what had ensued from that was the destruction of families with the pill and widespread contraception, Roe v. Wade. All of that had a huge impact on how these people saw dating, romance, marriage, all of this. And their children ended up being impacted, and now are dealing or trying to date in a healthy way, but are finding themselves having a lot of hangups because they haven't had role models for proper dating and courtship and marital behavior. And some will call this generational sin. It's that word is kind of a buzzword in a lot of Protestant circles, especially, but it really means that I want to make it clear that you're not responsible for the sins of your ancestors or your parents, but they do affect your life. And unless you break through those cycles, you can easily repeat that pattern, because that is what you have seen and what you think that is normal, but it's not normal. So I did want to bring up, Timmerie, one of my date coaching clients, and I'll call her Rebecca, of course, and I've changed some of the details because it's not totally her story, but I wanted to share it because I thought it was really powerful. She had a lot of trouble setting boundaries with men. And so we were working together, and she told me about a dream that she had of her mother driving her into a swamp. And I thought that was just, hang on to that vision as I tell you the rest of the story. But I asked her then about her relationship with her parents, and she then told me that her parents got divorced and she was raised by a single mom, and that didn't surprise me. But her mom, then she told me more. Her mom dated and slept around, and as Rebecca grew up, she felt like her house was just this revolving door of new men. And she told me they went on vacations with some of the men and their men's kids. And then her mom started living with some of the men, one at a time, not multiple. But all of these dysfunctional ways of dating and things that were not leading her mom to a marriage. It was just the same cycle over and over again of new guy, same pattern, dysfunction, living together, things breaking up. And she and her mom had a really close relationship. So it was very difficult because for her to even tell me things like about anything negative about her mom, because she loves her mom so much. But then she did share it with me that her mom would use Rebecca as a therapist for a lot of her life. So she would expect 24-hour access to her. She would need to be on her phone all the time. And if her mom wanted to ask her a question, and otherwise her mom would put a guilt trip on her. So as we were rehashing the story, Rebecca learned that she had learned these bad dating habits from her mom, and that dream that she had meant just that her mom, that the Lord was showing her that her mom was leading her through her mom's actions, was leading her into a swamp with how she was modeling dating behavior. And she needed to get out of that swamp and stop that cycle. Her dad was out of the picture, of course, so she didn't have a role model for a father figure either. But it's clear that from that story that our parents' generation went astray, but we can reclaim our love lives to make them happy and healthy the way that the Lord intended them. And that's what I work on with her.
Right. And it's so easy, Christina. It's Cristina Pineda here on Trending with Timmerie. She is a celebrity matchmaker with Matchmakers in the City, her company. And it's fascinating how easy it is when certain people function in a particular way around us. We tend to take up those same exact habits, good and bad. And especially when those habits are what is seen during your upbringing repetitively, it really shapes who you think you are and how you'll function, especially in relationships, whether dating or married. And so we're going to get to a lot of the good stuff in terms of how to overcome these bad habits, but let's also talk about, some of the signs that you see. How has a person's upbringing really impacted their dating and marriage situation in the practice of it?
Yeah, well, the question about marriage too is this is not just about dating. It's also about marriage, because even if people do get to the point of marriage, which is hard to get to if you've only seen that bad behavior modeled, there's effects for that as well. And that I had brought up to you about Mariah Carey, and Mariah Carey recently wrote a book called The Meaning of Mariah Carey. It just came out, and she says in this book that she thinks that she and her former husband, Nick Cannon, could have worked it out, but both of their egos and emotions, she said, got inflamed, and she said, which can translate into many billable lawyer hours, which is true. And it was tough. But it sounds like when it translates to marriage, a lot of people don't have the conflict resolution tips and advice and skills to be able to work out their problems, work out their differences. And then it can lead to a nasty divorce. But then Mariah, through examining her past, realized that actually we could have worked this out. And I thought that was pretty powerful for someone in her position to say, because it's humbling. You have to be humble to recognize that maybe I did make a mistake there. And maybe she saw a lot of people, if they've seen their parents fight and get divorced, they don't really know any other way to work out a marriage and work out how to do the marriage the right way.
Right. And I'm looking, Mariah Carey and Nick Cannon were married from 2008 to 2016. So it's been about 4 years since they've divorced. And isn't it interesting? Someone who's relatively very young still and had a very recent marriage is so quickly able to look back and say, we actually could have worked it out. And I think it's interesting when you hear from a lot of people who perhaps divorced and years later they look back and say, well, maybe we could have done something differently. And it's sad that so many people have to kind of hit that brick wall to finally say, I could be different. I could function in a different way. And this is where resources such as yourself, even in the midst of date coaching with a lot of your bachelors and bachelorettes, it's a reminder that God is calling us. He's inviting us into loving relationships, but we have to turn to him and rely on him first for a modeling of true, authentic, unconditional love, and not just allow ourselves to become a victim of those relationships during our upbringing or bad past relationships that we've experienced.
That's exactly it. And also figuring out what those patterns are that you're experiencing with your family now, because a lot of times, even if it's not, your dating life or marriage could be the problem, but if you focus on other relationships and try to establish boundaries with those, that can help everything.
Sick of those broken family habits and how it's impacting your love life, whether dating or married? We'll be right back with Matchmaker Cristina Pineda to talk about tips for breaking the cycle. Join us, stay with us during our marriage hour. I'll be right back.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
You can reclaim your love life and be happy and healthy as our Lord Jesus Christ is calling us to that unconditional love that he has given to us. He's asking us to step into that same type of sacrificial love within the context of relationships, dating, and marriage. So joining me is Matchmaker Cristina Pineda to discuss tips for breaking the cycle of generational sin and those bad habits that are picked up from family origin. Cristina, I know that in working with your bachelors and bachelorettes, you come across this often and you actually give boundary guides and homework for your bachelors to work on in order to reclaim their love life in the face of a broken past.
Yes. So one of my favorite homework assignments is to write a list of 5 ways of creating boundaries with your mom or with your dad, whoever it is that you're experiencing. You're feeling like, okay, we don't have any boundaries here, and this is affecting my life. So the reason is because creating boundaries with the family are the first step to creating a healthy romantic relationship. And if you don't have that, it's probably setting yourself up for an unhealthy marriage, because we all need to have healthy ways of interacting with each other. So that's a great way to begin. And then a lot of the dating issues and marriage issues come from this insecurity and a fear that they're not enough, and not understanding that we're made in God's image and we're so loved. So another thing that I'll have our bachelors and bachelorettes do is create a beloved charter. And this is something I learned when I was on a retreat a few years ago, where we went through you go through the Bible and you pick out your favorite Bible quotes, 5 or 6, you write them down, and then you put them in an order that you like the sound of it, and you address it to yourself. So it's like the Lord speaking to you. And then for 10 minutes for the next month, every day, you read that and you pray and you spend 10 minutes alone with the Lord. You envision the Lord coming into your house, coming in, sitting beside you, and speaking those words to you, speaking those promises to you, speaking those words of love to you. And one of my favorite, just to give you an example, one of my favorite Bible quotes from my own charter is Psalm 45 and 11 to 12, which is, "Listen, my daughter, and understand. Pay me careful heed. Forget your people and your father's house, that the king may desire your beauty." And that, I think, is so beautiful because it's talking about leaving the past behind. And we all have had some kind of dysfunction in our pasts, but the Lord is calling us to greater and richer things that we need to walk away from, sometimes walk away from the things that may be holding us back.
And that's a hard passage to bring up that you just brought up, Psalm 45, "Forget your people in your father's house, that the king might desire your beauty." But if we understand it, it's letting go of that brokenness or disordered attachments, more so, that can arise, that get in the way of us developing that relationship with God or developing that relationship with others. Because sometimes, based on what we are disorderly attached to or the brokenness we've experienced, it can really impact how we love. And so often in psychology, they talk about the importance of developing what's called disinterested love. That is a love that doesn't set me first, but puts the other person first. And it sounds so clinical and distant to say we want to love in a disinterested way, but it reminds us that we need to let go of those disordered attachments, those bad habits, so that we are free to actually love someone without putting our own past situation on it or assuming and reading into the context of various behaviors.
Yes. And I've also noticed that we can often say, "Oh, that was my past. I can't get away from it." But the Lord calls us to be more than a product. So the Lord calls you to be more than a product of your surroundings. And yes, that was your past, but he calls you to live in his majesty above the typical dealings of the world. And I was thinking about the book of Esther, because Esther found herself in where she was as a result of the choice of her ancestors. She lived in a secular world under a secular king. And we all have dealt with just a lot the past few weeks of just politically and everything. So we're all in a similar situation as her, all faithful Catholics. But we can control our own choices. And if you examine the patterns that your ancestors have established, you can choose to follow or to stray from them. So I will have our members look at your grandparents' marriages, see how they could have affected your parents. So this is multi-tiered. It's multi-generational. That's why we called it generational sin. Then look at your parents' marriages and life decisions and see how they have affected you. Maybe one of your grandparents was on the pill, took the pill. Maybe there's so many things that you can find, and you're not doing this to condemn them or to judge them. You're seeing, how did this affect how I was brought up and where I am today, and then saying, okay, that is the past. Now what choices am I going to make so that I don't continue this cycle?
Amen. I love that. And, I think this also brings up the importance of exposure to other marriages and healthy relationships that, you can see. Perhaps you may have come from a broken home, or perhaps you came from dysfunction, but setting yourself next to people who are ahead of you in life and who have good sets of examples and how they live out their married experience and how they resolve conflict and what they do to interact with each other to cope even in difficult situations can be an incredible opportunity for you to learn, even in the face of perhaps feeling like you didn't have those skills or never developed them in your own life.
Right. And actually, something that was wonderful for my husband and myself was before we got married, we did an engagement encounter with the Couple to Couple League. And in the Couple to Couple League, they have this little magnet that we have in our refrigerator that gives ways of managing conflict. And because we're talking about both dating and marriage, and I just thought they were so great. And do you mind if I read these, Timmerie?
Please do share, and let's talk about them.
Okay, perfect. So the first one is to pray So you're praying together, and that's often when we're upset at each other, when people are upset at each other, that's the last thing we think to do together, but praying. And to choose an appropriate time so that you're not, if someone's really upset, that you take a walk beforehand and choose a time when you've calmed down. Stick to the subject, no past history. Be honest, but not hurtful. No emotional nor physical abuse. No name calling nor use of sarcasm. No third parties. Listen and give each other equal time. When you are wrong, admit it. Ask for forgiveness if necessary. Use I feel messages. And hold hands. Holding hands, a lot of people have said that's the hardest one. People who I've date coached and marriage coached, that can feel like it's very out of place, but I've seen it really break down a lot of boundaries.
Mm-hmm. You know, a couple of those that really stood out as you're mentioning them, just for this conflict type of resolution, sticking to the subject rather than bringing all of these other topics. I know women tend to be a little more guilty of this, of, you know, kind of interconnecting every problem you've had or giving too many examples of the past, when I know sometimes the guys can be totally bombarded. What? I thought we were talking about X and you're talking about Y, Z, A, and B, or things that happened years ago. And so, you know, really sticking to the subject and not bringing up the past is a really good opportunity to actually work on your own past wounds, because sometimes the wounds that you've experienced in your own life are part of the reason why you're pointing back and holding on to grudges against your spouse.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And letting those come to light and spending time working through those with the Lord, the wounds from the past. That's why you may be married already, but you can still do this healing work that we're talking about, because it will, if it hasn't already, it will affect your marriage. And you might then at a separate time have a heart-to-heart with your husband or wife and say, this, I didn't bring this up last time when we were discussing the buying a new TV, for instance, and you were getting mad at each other for that. So you didn't bring up this other thing that made you upset because of that. So you then say, okay, let's talk about this deeper issue. This is why I reacted in the way that I did. And it's stemming from something that I experienced when I was growing up. And then you can really just, the intimacy, that's why conflict, we might get scared of it, but it actually deepens our relationships and creates a deeper intimacy than we even thought was possible. So even though we sometimes need to welcome these conflicts, and pray that through your conflicts, you will come closer to each other. If you do it in this way, you will.
That's Cristina Pineda from Matchmakers in the City. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Two other areas that stood out in that list from the Couple to Couple League for resolving conflict were, one, listening. You know, how often do we have to remind ourselves when we're fighting to actually listen to what the other person is saying, rather than already working on what we're going to say in response or that next thing we're going to throw into the argument, because by listening and being able to reiterate the other person's perspective or stance or frustration helps the other person to feel heard and loved, and helps us to understand what is at the root of this problem itself.
Yep, that is a hard one, but I think that the more we develop that listening ear, the easier it becomes. And then you can just have that time together, because like Timmerie was saying in the beginning of the show, our time is valuable, and we see there's the whole quote, time is money. Time is much more than money. And our relationships with our spouse, with our children, those are really the most important things that we could ever spend time on. And if we allow that time that we to be with our husband, to be with our wife, and to really listen, that is the best possible gift that you could give to your marriage.
That's Cristina Pineda here on Trending with Timmerie. You can find her at Matchmakers in the City We've also tagged her on social media. Cristina, thank you for joining us and giving your insights in marriage, love, and relationships. I'll be right back to talk about when is it time to see a therapist, overcoming differences with your spouse with regard to religion, might even come up while dating. We'll also talk about making decisions having to do with fertility and when others kind of feel judged by what you've decided to do, but you're trying to follow the church, you're not really sure how to respond. I'll be right back here on Trending with Timmerie.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Welcome back. One of the questions I received is, when is it time to see a therapist? Well, Sister Tina Alfieri has been with us regularly. She is a therapist, a sex addiction coach and recovery coach. And we walked through this question a couple weeks ago. And she said, here are some of the signs. Pay attention to the signs. When you argue without finding a clear resolution, perhaps you're arguing about religion, in-laws, or when there's a lack of luster and love in the bedroom. When children begin to manipulate the parents, in part because the parents are struggling on philosophical ideas having to do with parenting and philosophy. Those are all some key signs to start with to understand that perhaps it's a good time to bring in a third party. So we highly recommend CatholicTherapist.com to find a Catholic therapist near you. We'll post a link to that on social media. You can also find it in the podcast notes for this show, which, by the way, if you didn't catch a full show today, just head over to relevantradio.com/trending, where you can subscribe to the podcast, listen today, tomorrow, on demand, your favorite show here on Relevant Radio. Take us with you on the go, and even better, share it with a friend. Maybe there's a topic that you think someone would really benefit from. Text a link to this show so that they too can listen in. Another question that came up had to do with infertility, but not the question that you'd quite expect. The person on Instagram said, we chose not to do in vitro fertilization, but friends feel extremely judged by us because of our choice, because they themselves have gone through with IVF, in vitro fertilization. This is a great question. First, I want to commend you for choosing to stand in line with the Catholic Church and its teaching on fertility. You've made the right choice for your body and for your soul. For the potential children that you could possibly still conceive. Remember, in vitro fertilization, for those who don't know, put the body through super ovulation, so it often prevents that woman from ever being able to conceive naturally down the road because her body is forced into producing so many eggs at once. In fact, it can put young women into menopause as early as 20 or more years sooner than it should. You're also protecting those babies who would be conceived through the process of in vitro fertilization in a lab and a petri dish from being dishonored, in their creation, but also from being put in vulnerable situations where they could not thrive or continue to develop. And this is key. So you've made the right choice for your body, for your children, and for yourself. Now, with that being said, I commend your choice, but how do we handle this when friends, even maybe family, might criticize or feel judged and become a little upset when the topic comes up? This is an important moment that sometimes we forget. There's a sphere of concern and there's a sphere of change. Sphere of concern would be all these things that we can worry about and be agitated over, but in reality, there's only a little bit of what concerns us that we can actually change or influence. And when we see these two separate things, we're reminded that we could get really worked up about things that we can't control, or we could kind of let it go and acknowledge, this isn't my monkey. I can't put it on my back. And so this reminds us that we can't control the choices of others, and we also can't control their reactions to our choices. And this is really, really hard when it comes to friendship and fertility. I've been there. We were struggling to conceive a baby, and I knew that some of my health issues were in the way, but I had a lot of hope and faith and stood by. I would never use in vitro fertilization because of what I know about the science and the spiritual impact of IVF. Now, I remember a handful of times when I'd come across clients who I'd be teaching in Pilates, or sometimes even strangers, they would bring up their own fertility struggle, and I would mention a little bit about mine and also NAPRO doctors. And it was fascinating how quickly young, relatively very healthy women would look at me and say, well, why don't you just do IVF? I've done it. And when I said, well, I'm not really interested, and I gently, maybe mention, depending on who it is, a couple of the reasons, well, I don't get it. Why wouldn't you just try it? Because a lot of people don't have the informed information about the physical impact of IVF. And so they just think, well, you want something, go after it and get it. We live in a consumer culture, so if you want to buy something, go buy it. And unfortunately, that's how people act with children. And, we do that with regard to the small desires we have for food, ice cream, various activities, places to go. Why couldn't we do it with the things that we desire most, such as children and marriage? Buy a spouse, buy a child. And so we're talking about a different way of living and an attitude that really does irk people. Now, we have to come from a position of compassion with regard to fertility. The fact that many of our friends and family will continue to utilize in vitro fertilization. It's an opportunity to talk about the impact, but it's also an opportunity to recognize they know the process if they've been through it, and they know that they are uneasy and at times angry because of the process, and they don't know what to do with those emotions. A couple of years ago, I was sitting at a coffee shop, and for some reason, I was working on something, I think, for the radio show, and something having to do with in vitro fertilization was up on my screen. And a gentleman next to me at the coffee shop decided to kind of just reach right in and say, hey, I see you're looking at IVF. And thus ensues a conversation about what I do and why I was researching in vitro fertilization. And he ends up sharing, he was a gentleman probably in his 50s or 60s, I don't remember exactly. And he shared that his wife and him had struggled to conceive a child. And they went through about 20 years ago a process of in vitro fertilization. They never were able to conceive via IVF, and it left his wife truly unable to work or have good social engagements with friendships. And it really weighed down on their marriage. It left her emotionally very, very damaged, and it left their marriage very impacted. He said, for me to come out and go to a coffee shop is easy, but for her, it's difficult to leave the house. I bring this story up because we really do have to have compassion on the IVF issue. When people are angry at us for not trying it, or critical, or they feel judged, it's because the process of IVF is so harmful for the physical wellness of the woman's body, but also for the spiritual dimension of who she is in that marriage. In fact, my guest, Dr. Susan Caldwell, will often join us here on the show, and her marriage really fell to shambles because of decisions having to do with fertility and those attitudes going into marriage and going into child rearing that can really impact how you raise your children and how you interact in a relationship. I remember there's a moment in her story where she talks about how her and her husband had gone through with IVF and how they looked at each other at one point and they just knew, this isn't right. This isn't right. And it's weighed on their souls, and so many people who have gone through with that process. And so I want to encourage you, if someone's feeling judged about any issue, maybe it might even be that you're pregnant and they had an abortion, or that you are choosing not to use in vitro fertilization and they tried. Maybe they conceived, maybe they didn't. We need to have a soft landing place and a future place for them to heal, for there to be resources for them to walk past the brokenness of the decisions that they were told were a quick, easy fix to fertility or whatever it might be. And so these moments when people feel judged by our actions are moments to continue to witness God's love and mercy in the culture. Again, I commend you for not using in vitro fertilization, but I encourage you to not be afraid when someone else is upset by your own decisions in your life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, heard here on Relevant Radio. Another question that came up for today's Marriage Hour is how to be more romantic. She commented on Instagram, neither of us are very good at it. It's a seasoned married couple. Well, this is a great question having to do with romance. I'm not sure if you're talking about just being romantic and sitting and watching the sunset, or sitting and having a nice dinner, or more than that, but we'll touch on both for a second. Sometimes I think, especially for couples who have been married much longer, there's this attitude to kind of overcomplicate romance. And there's an important need to remember that sometimes familiarity makes us numb. And we don't realize that they're actually great moments that are actually occurring, and sometimes we miss them. In fact, there is a therapist, his name's Dr. Gottman, and he talks a lot about relationships and making reparative attempts and so forth. But he also talks about making touches of contact and how important it is. For example, if I were to say, "Oh, hey, you look really nice today," it's actually important that my spouse responds to me and says, "Thanks." Or, for example, if I, make a gesture to kind of tell someone to come over, it's important that if they see me, that they respond. How these little moments of contact throughout the day can actually be a really key sign of the success of the marriage, but also of the relationship in and of itself. And this is what I thought of when I thought about this question having to do with romance. That romance is simpler than we sometimes make it. Now, perhaps you find yourself just wishing and wanting more of those romantic moments. Key things that can be done have to do with, what can I do for the other person? Perhaps you outright ask them, what kind of nice dinner would you like that would be romantic? Me cook? Us go to a specific place for dinner? Maybe it's a matter of planning a getaway. And you can anticipate that getaway. Perhaps you could take a weekend trip somewhere, save up, have it scheduled on your calendar. You take the time and plan for it. And in fact, sometimes even just the anticipation of that trip can be part of the romance and building up to this intentionality having to do with your spouse. Now, this anticipation is something that is also discussed having to do with intimacy as well. That if you want more romance in that respect, it's important perhaps to communicate with your spouse. Let them know that, I know we're busy, I know you're stressed, but let's plan a time in the near future. Now, I know there's this kind of anticipation that can occur, but at the same time, this discomfort by saying, "Hey, honey, let me put it on your calendar." But what happens is it prepares us in a very busy culture to remember to focus on intimacy, to focus on romance, whether it's intimacy of spouses that only belongs to spouses, or the intimate romance of watching a sunset. But ask your spouse, communicate, see what the other person loves. Again, sometimes familiarity really can get in the way of remembering to think about what the other might appreciate. And I always throw this out there because I love it. The 5 Love Languages is an incredible book and a test that you can go through to really understand, well, what is my spouse and what am I looking for that will build up what is referred to as my love tank. It's a book written by, I believe, Gary Chapman. I'm not sure if that's a Dr. Gary Chapman, but Gary Chapman. He talks about how we all have certain types of needs for how we feel love, experience love, and show love. So for example, maybe I'm a gift giver, and that's the way I like to show love to people. But maybe my spouse likes acts of kindness. And that's his love language. And I could give him all the gifts I want, but if I'm not doing acts of service for him, he's not really feeling like his love tank is built up. And so there's this disconnect within the relationship. And so Dr. Gary Chapman ends up talking a lot about how important it is to not only know our love language and what fills us up, but what fills up our spouse, our children, and even a lot of those key relationships in our life. So I think that's another great place to start to build up that stronger relationship, working toward romance, communication, and so forth. And it follows up even on the conversation we had having to do with a generational sin and upbringing and conflict resolution within marriages. So again, that's the 5 Love Languages by Gary Chapman, an incredible resource. Another question that came up that so many spouses have to walk through is what happens when my spouse is maybe in a different place spiritually, perhaps not practicing the same religion, or perhaps they're just at a different place on their spiritual journey and there's animosity when the topic of religion comes up. There's a disconnect or there's a stone wall that occurs. What do I do? This is a really important moment to recognize that God is ultimately one of our greatest. He is our greatest desire. St. Augustine talks about how our souls are restless until they rest in Him. Now, sometimes people don't realize what their greatest desire really is, that is God, and they go searching for it in other places. But deep down inside, this longing for God is always present. And so often what can happen when someone sees you and your strong faith, especially those people we're closest to, is there can actually be a great sense of pain and loss in that other person's life with regard to the relationship you have with God and the fact that they're not quite there. There's something they are missing out on. And rather than expressing that pain or desire for God, they can become defensive. Well, I don't have to go to confession. I'm fine. Or, and I don't have to go to church. And there are all these things that can come up. I don't have to pray that way. Me converting to Catholicism isn't important. You see, their anger is really a sign of that discord or even longing. You could even call it a jealousy for what you have that they don't have. And so again, when your spouse is in a different place with regard to religion, it's a pain for them too, just as it is for you. And that's sometimes really difficult to remember, but that should help us to change our approach on what we're bringing up with regard to religion. Maybe they're not ready to talk about confession. Maybe they're not there for the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. But there can be those simple moments of reaching out and contact and invitation that rather is an invitation rather than a burden or a debate with regard to God. We'll be back tomorrow here on Trending with Timmerie, and my husband will actually be joining me.